Well, hi, friends. It's Patrick Kirby, Do Good Better Consulting. Welcome to another guest expert training, and we've got a great one for you on a topic that I guarantee you haven't put a lot of time and effort into, but you damn well should. I am blessed to have Valerie Leonard, who is joining us. She is the founder of, Nonprofit Utopia?
That's correct.
I love it. It's a great name. She is helping nonprofits everywhere do a whole bunch of fundraising things, and her expertise that she likes to talk about is compliance. And I know on the surface it doesn't sound like, hey, why are we talking about compliance? This has nothing to do with fundraising. But what if I told you it has everything to do with fundraising? Valerie, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Patrick. This is awesome.
I am very excited, and only the super nerds of the world unite can talk about this stuff with enthusiasm and gusto, and I have all the confidence in the world that you get to do this. So before we get started, why don't you give a little background on who you are, how you got started, what you're doing now, and we'll ramp up and kind of talk about how you can help sort of guide the nonprofit world as far as compliance goes.
Oh, sure. Again, my name is Valerie Leonard. I am first and foremost a consultant to nonprofit organizations. And the way I got started is I actually ran a nonprofit organization. I started off a new initiative. I actually spun it off from a neighborhood group that was funded by a family foundation. So we started off as an initiative of a family foundation. We got our independence, so to speak, and I had a good opportunity to see, all the things that could possibly go wrong and what it is like to actually develop an organization under pressure. Mm-hmm. After working there about 3 years and putting all the infrastructure in place, doing all the fundraising and all that good stuff, I started my own practice working with nonprofit organizations all throughout the city of Chicago and the metropolitan area. I am on staff with the University of Illinois at Chicago with their nonprofit program. And I noticed too that all roads lead to compliance. I don't care what I'm working on. It could be strategic planning, it could be finance, it could be board development. Everybody seems to have a compliance problem. And if you look at, the website for the IRS, they will, those statistics will bear themselves out. I think it's about 20% of our organizations nationwide at some point will have a compliance issue to the point where they have not filed their 990s in time for 3 years and then lose their tax exempt status. So, once I found that out and then dealing with some of the clients that I have, I said, there's got to be a better way. So I've been kind of preaching, hopefully not just to the choir, but to some of the sinners as well. Yeah. There's got to be a better way. So that's kind of how I got started. And a little bit about Nonprofit Utopia. I thought that would be a wonderful way to bring together everything that I do. I do a little teaching, I do a little training. I love being on Facebook. I love being on LinkedIn. And this is a way we actually created a safe space for nonprofits. It's the ideal community for emerging nonprofit leaders, but we also have some seasoned professionals so we can cross-pollinate ideas. Have some of us older people share our headaches with some of the young people and let them not do the same things that we did. They shouldn't have to learn things the hard way. So we can actually have safe conversations. There's some courses that people can download. We have meetups, we have webinars, and all that good stuff. We have podcasts, just everything that we can do to create a community around not just compliance. You'll be happy to know it's not just compliance, around nonprofit issues, and people can actually organize within their groups. If you want to start a new program, you can talk about that. If you want to link up with people in your city, you can group, by geography, by interest, and all that good stuff. But that's really not why we're here. We're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about compliance. And forgive me for going on and on and on.
Well, I love it because those that watch this and those that are sort of in our group here in the Midwest, the way Northwest, we're Canada, are essentially in kind of the same boat where there's not a safe space to talk about some of these things. And really, when it comes to compliance, this is one of those words that not a lot of development directors understand. Mm-hmm. And they don't feel comfortable addressing some of these things, either with the board or their executive director. So we don't talk about it because we don't know everything. And you know as well as I do, and every development director is just hesitant to do anything unless they know every single thing, whatever. And then they just sit there and it gets worse and they don't talk about it. And then and then it blows up in your face and you're like, well, I could have done something about it, but I didn't understand it, and poof. So I think maybe we start there. How do we start? How do we start the conversation? What are we looking for initially? How do we tiptoe in to do some of the little things to have a conversation about compliance as someone who does fundraising or works in a nonprofit?
Okay, and quite honestly, that depends on where you are in your development and whether or not you have a fire to put out. Okay, so in an ideal situation, you want to, as a member of the board of directors, you want to talk about compliance, I guess on an annual basis, at least, when you're doing your audits, right? And we should also know that when you're on a board, you're liable for whatever goes on, whether you know about it or not. So it pays to be as informed as possible. So if you are a board member and you don't really know that much about compliance, one thing I would recommend is perhaps having an expert come in and do a workshop and tell you and your board about the importance of compliance as it relates to your roles and responsibilities as a board member. Because, like I said before, whatever happens, whether you know about it or not, as a board member, you are responsible. One of the ways that you can make it attractive, you can let people know, again, if you are compliant, that opens the doors. That's just a basic threshold. Mm-hmm. And another way to actually make this exciting is to talk about the Guidestar profiles. Mm-hmm. So in order to do a Guidestar profile, and then let me back up. Guidestar is a super nonprofit that has a relationship with the IRS where they have access to all of the filings that we file on an annual basis. So whether you give Guidestar permission or not, the IRS has already given them permission to scan in all of the 990s. So they have on file 990s on their website, right? Mm-hmm. And the good thing is they offer a product called Guidestar Profiles, and they have 4 different levels. There's the bronze level, there's the silver, gold, and platinum, and it offers a reward system, so to speak, for your compliance. And the information that you're providing, the basis of the information you're providing is from your 990s, but it goes even further. Well, with your 990s, you can share information about, your latest accomplishments. So you can use that not only as an opportunity to discuss your financials, but discuss what's going on with the organization. So you can talk about performance management, you can talk about your board, et cetera, et cetera. But once you have this Guidestar profile, you then set yourself apart from the other organizations, throughout the country. We have about 1.4 million nonprofit organizations that are in good standing. And I believe fewer than 10% have actually taken advantage of the Guidestar profiles. Mm-hmm. So you can actually use that profile to set yourself apart. And so that makes it appealing to the fundraising people who might not necessarily pay attention to the financials except as they're evaluating your proposal.
Sure. It's funny about that too is when you're talking to your board about compliance and maybe even using Guidestar as your entertainment piece to it, right? So it gives you a little treat. You get a star, and then you get this, and you get it's that badge reward system that everybody's trying to conjure up on social media, but in the board meeting. But I think the also thing that you touched on too is that you're training your board members to be good board members. I think that we talked about this on a couple of other issues on this sort of guest expert training, is that the lack of good and educated board members is striking. I mean, it's killing organizations. There's no onboarding process. It's just horrible. And then, so you're, as an organization, are taking your due diligence to actually train good board members so they can go to another board and then relay that particular expertise there as well. You're paying it forward by just talking about this in the first place.
Right.
And as board members, we should be excited about this, because now we get a brag bullet on our resume, right? So I know and understand what to look for in regards to compliance when I go to your board, right? It's something that I can offer rather than just a checkbook or a Rolodex opener. I can offer you as an organization another set of eyes to look for something that I've done in a former life, or whatever that is, at another organization. So I think that's the little carrot you can dangle in front of board members to get them excited about talking about this stuff.
Right. And two, it's interesting. We're at the year end now. And I have heard horror stories where, in one instance, the state came up with additional funding, right? And they called one of the organizations with whom they had a relationship, and they wanted to just give them a windfall. But it just so happens this organization had not filed their 990 for that particular year. So they were not able to take advantage of the windfall because they were not in compliance.
Right.
And typically, when you do the 990s, you have to also go through an audit process and all that good stuff. So they were not able to turn that around in time. So it's very important. And most people don't find out about how important a 990 is until some crisis comes up.
That's usually the case. Then it's usually the scramble, and then it's trying to find an expert who's already booked up, and it's just it's a pain. So I think maybe to talk a little bit about, okay, you don't have a crisis going on, but hey, there's always a possibility of one fire to start.
Right.
What are a couple of things that are traditionally the ones you see the most out of compliance, and how to avoid that on early, so you don't have to just sit there with a bucket and you're just pouring water everywhere, and it's usually an oil fire, and that's just spreading everywhere, and you didn't put salt on it, and it just gets worse and worse. But just a couple of a couple of items that you can avoid that are not too difficult, but will get you aligned and thinking about compliance on a regular basis.
Okay, great. One of the first things you should avoid is filing late. There are penalties for filing late. Another thing you should avoid is not filing for 3 years. I had a client, the client had an accountant, the client had an attorney, but neither the accountant nor the attorney was well versed in nonprofit. They were people who were used to working with corporations and small businesses and didn't really know the nonprofit laws. So there was no one to flag to them. And this was a startup organization. They had been in existence for 3 years. There was no one to let them know that they need to file these on a regular basis. So they got a letter from the IRS saying that you haven't filed for 3 years straight. If you don't get this right, you could lose your tax exempt status. But in the interim, here are the penalties. They had racked up $10,000 worth of penalties, and this was a startup, right? So they couldn't, if they'd have paid $10,000, they could have gone out of business. And what we did was we put them in contact with, first of all, an attorney who was well versed in taxes. Second of all, a CPA who had a relationship with the IRS, who really understood how this stuff works. And we were able to develop a plan of action. We said, mea culpa, we throw ourselves on the sword, right? This will never happen again. And we came up with the compliance calendar, came up with the plan as to how we could avoid this in the future. And the IRS accepted it. And with the CPA did a letter as well. And they were able to get rid of those penalties, but not everybody knows about that, right? So it doesn't always have to be a disaster. Another thing people should avoid is, just good governance, things like don't have a conflict of interest, no self-dealing. And people think that they're getting away with this self-dealing, and they think that things are okay, but there's a spot on the 990 where you have to disclose relationships, any financial relationships amongst the board members or any business relationships, et cetera, et cetera. One egregious example that I have seen, and this is a true example, there was an organization that is in the business of actually helping small businesses, right? But they didn't make any loans to the community. However, they made a loan to their president, their board president, the board president and the board vice president. Now, 2 of 3 of these 3 board members were actually collecting salaries. They were collecting salaries, but they were board members. Mm-hmm. And then the board president was also collecting rent from this organization. Now, if you are someone like me, I'm very detail oriented, and some funders are detail oriented. They have different levels of expertise, but one of the red flags you would look for is those conflicts of interest and evidence of self-dealing, and that could be a problem. So if you know that that's a problem, you should not engage in those activities whatsoever.
Well, if there was only something in the news recently within, I don't know, the last 48 hours of perhaps somebody who is very well known in this country that had that same compliance issue happen to. I don't know. I'll have to look at the news later. I forget who it was.
Right. I have no idea who you could be talking about.
If you ever needed a hint on what not to do, read that, and then you'll be fine.
Right.
What are some simple steps? Is there? So what about a disclosure issue? It's as simple as what? Is it just a sheet of paper saying write out what your conflict of interest is? Is it signed by the board to get you in compliance? As just an example for that, what can you do to avoid that conflict of interest piece for all things? Just for that as an example for you.
Right. And then, in some cases, there may be extenuating circumstances where you can't help but to have the conflict of interest. Right. But you don't want to create a pattern. So you want to have a conflict of interest policy, and the IRS actually has a sample policy that you need to complete when you're developing your new organization in the first place. So not only do you have that policy, but you need to make sure that leadership actually enforces the policy. So the policy would talk about, they would describe what a conflict of interest is. You need to disclose any conflict that you might have, and then you also need to recuse yourself from a vote on any issue that could, that would present a conflict for you. However, if you get to a point where you have several of those conflicts and several board members are recusing themselves, that can be problematic. And, the IRS, from time to time, they will do an audit, not only financially, but they're going to be looking at those relationships. And organizations have also lost their tax exempt status because of self-dealing, because of conflicts of interest. And we know about the very high profile case. That's a wonderful example of what can happen.
The timing of our conversation couldn't be better as of today. I just think
right.
Just 2 points, because I think we're going to take a turn into the fundraising piece, because I think that's the super important, interesting piece. One is the expenses can be very minimal when trying to find materials to keep you in line, right? It's free template on the IRS site. It is Guidestar that gives you all of these resources for free. There are the monetary excuse, because I think that's a lot of boards are like, well, we can't afford somebody to come in and tell us all these things. You're like, you might not be able to spend 50 grand. I understand that. But you can spend free and you can go get them, and it's for you there. And then the other thing too is, if you're a nonprofit, you're trying to pay fines because you haven't been compliant. It's one thing to have a recover your debt campaign for donors. Like, hey, listen, we did this and our programming exploded and we have to fundraise for it. That's one thing. And people can be very interested in that. It's another thing to go, well, we screwed up and didn't file our paperwork on time. You should give us some money. Like, nobody wants to donate to that. I'm sorry. It's avoid that at all costs.
Right.
So what are some of the tips that you can help us navigate through on using your great compliance as far as conversations to have with donors? I mean, there's that typical donor who is very, I am a stickler for rules, and I want to make sure you do this. Not just that person, but how do you create or develop talking points with your funders about how special and great you are as an organization because you're compliant? Right.
And it's interesting. Usually the conversation about compliance will start with the funder. And obviously they want to know what your compliance is like before they give you money. So they're going to ask you for things like a certificate of good standing. And in many cases, they will do their own diligence and not even talk to you about it. They'll go to, and say, in the state of Illinois, we have CyberDrive Illinois, where people can go. That's operated by our Secretary of State. So they could go to the Secretary of State's website and then check and see if you're in compliance without even talking to you. Another instance where a funder is going to talk to you about compliance is, suppose you want to do capacity building. So as part of that capacity building conversation, they'll probably do an assessment, and one of the assessments will be, board governance. It will be around finance, and they'll ask you a series of questions about your practices as they relate to compliance. Now, if you're dealing with government funders, they care about compliance a little bit more than others, because after all, they're the ones who are regulating. And I'm not saying that private funders don't care, but they're more stringent about those conversations than, say, a private funder will be. So how do you talk about those conversations? First of all, I would let them broach it. Or if you want to separate yourself from the pack, a good way to broach the conversation about compliance indirectly is to talk about your Guidestar profile. You can refer them to your Guidestar profile, and they know that if you have a Guidestar profile, you had to have completed your 990. So that's a subtle way of saying that, yes, we're in compliance. However, we have done more than what's required of us. At a very minimum, nonprofits are required to do the 990. They're required to do the state filing, the state counterpart. And if you do a Guidestar profile, that's giving additional information. It's opening up your organization. I guess you're showing more transparency. And the more transparent you are, the more you can build trusting relationships with those nonprofits, with your funders. And the more you share with them, the more likely they are to trust you. I just had a meeting with a client, the other day, and he was saying that he just met with the funder. The funder normally gives only 1 year at a time, but because they were able to set themselves apart through their financial discussion and their disclosure, the funder voluntarily said, we're going to fund you for 2 years. And, that's almost unheard of, for people to go against, their rules, so to speak. But they were just so impressed with the level of disclosure that this client shared. So,
and almost using everybody else's non-compliance as a bonus point for your own. Without needing to say, well, these people don't do this or these people don't do that. Right. They'll naturally find out that, oh, I didn't know that this went here or they didn't do this. And you can just be steady Eddie the entire time saying, well, we've always been compliant. This is kind of what we do. Right. Not making a big deal out of it becomes sometimes a big deal when, you've got people looking into it who are very financial. And I think as people are, this tax discussion, which is go on in perpetuity.
Right.
I don't know how this is going to be. People are going to become very selective on who they donate to at some of those larger levels, and they are going to be very nitpicky, I think. Those extreme high capacity donors are going to be very picky about what happens and how their money is being spent, because the level of need for them to give at this consistent high level is going to be way more if the small and medium-sized donors just kind of fall off by the wayside. And they're going to be the ones who are going to be doing the heavy lifting, which means they're going to do the heavy asking. And if you can be compliant, you can have the conversation. We don't need any restrictions on your gifts because we are very good at what we do, right? So that trust, like when you're talking about that trust level, I think a lot of donors, especially the major gift donors, are being very specific now on what they want, because I don't think they trust organizations as much as they used to because of all these crazy compliance issues, or there's so many nonprofits. So if you can prove to yourself that you are an organization that is just here and we are doing everything in our due diligence, you can begin to have that critical conversation about non-restricted gifts, because they trust you. You've had enough deposits in your trust bank account with the donor that they will give you the ability to spend money where you see best fit, not them.
Right. And so another way that you can demonstrate transparency is to put at least 3 years worth of your 990s right there on your website.
Right.
Now, not many organizations do that. The IRS recommends it. They don't say that you have to, but you can really set yourself apart by doing, just something, something so basic, but it's so powerful, because many organizations try to hide public information. I've even had one organization, I asked for their 990. This is a public document. By law, you need to make available 3 years of your 990s.
Right.
This organization refused. Now, if I wanted to, I could have reported them to the IRS. There's an actual box on their complaint form that asks about whether or not, there was a problem with their even sharing the 990. So people have a tendency to be very canny, but if documents are public, then they should be shared.
Right. And I think this gives you the opportunity to not only have a discussion internally, but with your board on what those numbers mean. It means CEO salary and top 20 donors. And it gives you, but you have to start, it gives you a framework to have a conversation about talking points. And so you can spin, and I mean that in a nice positive way.
Right.
You can spin what those numbers mean to your organization and the programs and services that you provide. And I think the less transparent you are, the more question marks like, hey, what's wrong with this? And you begin to sow doubt into the donor's mind. And the more doubt they have, the other organizations who don't have doubt are looking a lot better if they kind of align with the donor's wants and needs to have this similar programs to donate to. So.
Yeah, and you know what? That brings to mind yet another Guidestar product. Guidestar has, gobs and gobs of information. One thing you can do is subscribe to their databases. They're not cheap, but you can begin to set benchmarks. You can, look at your own financial performance and benchmark yourselves against, similarly situated organizations. They could be organizations that are doing the same thing in the same city. And then you can identify where you're doing better, and you can use that, as your selling point.
Right.
Or, if you're very, very anal, you can do this manually without the help of presto changeo buttons that Guidestar would have to filter the information. But
there's a handful of our friends will be watching this who very relate to the anal thing, and it will be I'll get it right. And another thing too is you can grab information from your local or regional council of nonprofits as well, and they'll have that benchmark thing against too. And just to keep up, it's not keeping up with the Joneses, but you can use that for strategic planning. You can use that for board guidance. You can use that for your own internal things. just to say, what are other people doing at the same time? So I love that. And it's a wonderful mechanism on how to use that from a fundraising standpoint, not just
Right.
boring pen to paper, typing out for things. And here's the weird part. We're already up against 30 minutes, which is the craziest thing in the entire world. I can't even believe that. This was way too much fun. And who knew you would have so much fun listening and talking about compliance? But before we go, because there might be a lot of people who have a lot of questions and you are the expert in the room, how do people get a hold of you if they have questions? If they have an inkling and they want to know about the Nonprofit Utopia, they want to ask you questions about compliance, they want to connect with you on social media, give the sales pitch. How can they get a hold of you, and how can they connect and sort of reach out and chat with you about all things?
Okay, sure. First of all, if you have, just a quick question, you can always email me. My email is Valerie F as in Frank, Leonard at nonprofitutopia.com. If you want to find out more about Nonprofit Utopia, there are 2 websites. You could go to nonprofitutopia.com. That is our public website, and you can get a real good sense for what it is that we do in the community. And then we have a community website. You can at least get to the landing page, and that will give you some really good information. And that is nonprofitutopia.mn.co. And that will, give you information. And if you are so inspired after reading the landing page, we would love to have you as a member. Definitely.
I love it. Now, we'll, as with everybody, we will drop links in the comments below and make sure that we continue this conversation offline and for continuing purposes. We'll link it in the Do Good Better site. We'll link it in the Do-Gooders Network site and on YouTube and everywhere else this video is going to pop up talking about all things compliance. Valerie, I am so grateful for your time this morning. I am so glad we got to do this. The timing couldn't be more perfect. I swear to you, this is where you look up at the Lord and you're like, Matt, thanks for this one, buddy. This works.
Yes. Yes. And you know what, Patrick, too, if you don't mind, I will send you it's an article that I wrote, just checking, and it will have the list of all the things you should be looking for. We talked about the 990s, but, there are a number of other things that we need to be looking out for as well.
That would be wonderful. We thank you always. Those of us joining us live, thanks for much for joining us live. Those watching in the replay, thanks for watching us on the replay. We'll be back later with more delightful guests. Valerie, thank you so much for being here with us today, and we'll chat with you soon.
Okay, awesome. You got to come onto my podcast as well, so we will definitely be in touch.
I love it. Thank you very, very much. Appreciate it. Bye.
Okay, thank you. All right, bye-bye.